Good evening, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Ryan Davis, and I am the chair of the JFK Jr. Forum Committee here at the Institute of Politics. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located on both the park side and the JFK Street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, please walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. You can join the conversation tonight online by tweeting with the hashtag #HolderForum, which is also listed in your program. Immediately following this afternoon's forum, the Institute of Politics will be hosting two different events. First, the former mayor of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Michael Nutter, will speak with students in LaTower 275. Second, in LaTower 166, there will be a conversation on infrastructure, transportation, and energy with former Obama Deputy Assistant and National Economic Council Deputy Director Jason Muller with former IOP Fellow Johannes Abraham. There's information on both events on the insert in your program, and snacks will be served. Please take your seats now and join me in welcoming our guests, former Attorney General Eric Holder, Professor Archon Fung, and Dean of the Harvard Kennedy School, Doug Elmendorf.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is my great pleasure to introduce the Edwin L Godkin Lecture. The Godkin Lecture was established at Harvard in 1903, a good deal before the founding of the Kennedy School. The lecture honors Edwin Godkin, who was a 19th century Irish-born American journalist who founded the political and cultural magazine The Nation and was editor-in-chief of the New York Evening Post. The inaugural Godkin Lecture in 1903 was introduced by Charles William Eliot, then the president of Harvard, who praised Godkin's, quote, remarkable vigor and great candor and unremitting devotion to lofty ideals of public duty, unquote. More than 100 years later, the ideals of public duty remain a central focus of Harvard and of the Kennedy School. Many distinguished public leaders have spoken in the Godkin Lecture about public duty, including both the duties of leaders and the duties of citizens. Today's Godkin Lecturer is an ideal person to speak with us about public duty because of his own service as a very distinguished public leader, and because of his continuing efforts to ensure that all Americans have a fair opportunity to exercise their duties. We are honored today to be joined by former Attorney General Eric Holder. Eric Holder is an internationally recognized leader on a broad range of legal issues and a tireless advocate for civil rights. He served in the U.S. government for more than 30 years. He began his legal career at the Public Integrity section of the Justice Department. In 1988, President Reagan appointed him to be a Superior Court judge in the District of Columbia. In 1993, he stepped down from the bench to accept an appointment from President Clinton as U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia. And he held that position until he became Deputy Attorney General in 1997. From 2009 to 2015, Eric Holder served as the 82nd Attorney General of the United States and the first African American to ever hold that position. When President Obama nominated him in 2008, the president praised his, quote, toughness and independence, unquote. As Attorney General, he vigorously defended voting rights, including the enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. In 2014, Eric Holder was named to Time magazine's list of 100 most influential people for his tireless work, quote, to ensure equal justice, unquote. The National Legal Aid and Defender Association has honored him with the Justice John Paul Stevens Lifetime Achievement Award. The National Urban League named him a recipient of their Living Legend Award. And the NAACP honored him with its Thurgood Marshall Lifetime Achievement Award. Eric Holder is currently a partner at Covington and Burlington and serves as chairman of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, which is tackling the problem of gerrymandering. Eric Holder will be in conversation today with our very own Archon Fung, the academic dean, and the Winthrop Laflin McCormack Professor of Citizenship and Self-Government at the Kennedy School. Archon's research, as you may know, explores ways to improve the quality of democratic governance with a focus on public participation, deliberation, and transparency. He co-directs the Transparency Policy Project and leads democratic governance programs at our Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. We're on for a very exciting hour. Please join me in welcoming Archon Fung and our distinguished guest, Eric Holder. How are you?
Thanks very much, Doug, for that introduction, and thank you, Attorney General Holder, for spending this afternoon with us.
Good to be here.
I thought I'd ask
if
if
you have to pay for the seats up there.
We give them away.
Oh, okay, good. Way up there.
So I thought I'd begin with a couple of questions, or a few questions, and then we'd open it up to the audience.
Sure.
First question is, after you left the federal government, you could have chosen to work on many, many civic issues, but you decided to focus a lot of your public leadership and energy on the issue of redistricting. It's not the most obvious issue to focus on. It's kind of a democracy wonk issue compared to something like racial equality or social justice or the anti-Trump resistance. So why redistricting? Why did you pick that issue to focus on?
Well, I picked redistricting because it really is kind of the foundation for all the other things that you talked about. If you want to have a fair voting system that has the ability to shape the direction of the country, it seems to me that you got to have, well, we should have a redistricting effort done in 2021 that makes it a battle between conservative, Republican ideas, Democratic, progressive ideas, and let's see, who wins. I think if the lines are drawn fairly, that Democrats and progressives will do just fine, and that necessarily means, therefore, that you will have an impact on the other issues that you mentioned, racial issues, voting issues, issues around LGBT rights, choice, gun laws. All of these things, I think, are a function of who actually sits in our state legislatures and who sits in Congress.
Thank you.
And who's in the White House?
And who's, of course.
That's not quite part of what I'm supposed to be, but that matters as well, as we have seen.
As we're finding out.
Yes.
In a March 27th article in the Washington Post, that article was reporting on the Maryland redistricting case that's been since fused with a Wisconsin case that the Supreme Court is considering. In a deposition for that case, former Governor Martin O'Malley said that, as elected governor, I did my duty within the metes and bounds of Maryland law to organize redistricting in favor of the Democratic Party. He said, quote, if the reconfigured district would be more likely to elect a Democrat than a Republican, yes, this was clearly my intent. So he thought it was his duty as a Democratic governor to gerrymander to advantage the Democrats. I know a lot of other Democrats who think the same way, that the Republicans are doing it, where they have state level majorities in the legislature, where Democrats have a majority. Of course, we should gerrymander to favor the Democratic Party. Do you agree with that sentiment? What would you say to people with that kind of point of view?
That's not consistent with the aims of the NDRC. It's not why I signed up to head the NDRC. I'm not here to gerrymander for Democrats. And there are people within the party who have been taken aback by some of the things that we have advocated and the ways in which we say districts ought to be configured. You know, we've got an 85% Democratic district that is really gerrymandered. Well, you know, maybe that ought to come down to something that is more competitive, and therefore Democrats would have to have potentially have a serious challenger come November, state level, congressional level, whatever. Given all the negatives that we have seen associated in this decade with Republican gerrymandering, and they were far better at it than Democrats were in 2011. That's not, given the arc of my career and the things that have been important to me, that would be inconsistent with who I hope I am and what my work has stood for. So this is not an attempt to gerrymander on behalf of Democrats. I think Governor O'Malley is quite honest in what he said there, and I would disagree with what Maryland Democrats did to create that district.
Even if it costs Democrats some congressional seats. And
yeah, as I said, I think that was wrong, but I think what what the Republicans did in Wisconsin, Ohio, North Carolina, Texas, that was wrong as well. And if Princeton did a study, I'm from Columbia, this is Harvard, but Princeton, this is kind of a third-rate opinion, but it's the best we could do.
That's where we are now.
Oh, so we have some Princeton people. Huh? All right. How'd you let? All right. Anyway, Princeton said that what the Republicans did in 2011 was the worst gerrymandering of the last 50 years. And so you've got that Democratic district, one district in Maryland that I think was done inappropriately, but compared to what Republicans did in 2011, it pales by comparison. But I think it's all wrong.
I agree. So let's talk a little bit about the path to more fair redistricting. Who should draw the electoral maps? There's all kinds of ways. As you know, in most places, it's state legislatures that draw the maps, and that's why there's as much gerrymandering as there is. In some states, there's independent commissions, such as Arizona. California has a novel body supported by Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, among all people, in which tens of thousands of regular citizens apply to be on the Citizens Redistricting Commission. They select 14 of them, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, 4 independents. Nobody can have a very close connection with a public official, and then that body draws the map. So that's more like a kind of jury, if you like. But there's you could get retired judges, you could get political scientists and mathematicians, you could have a bipartisan commission, you could do jury thing like California. Do you think one mechanism is better than any other?
I think the ideal mechanism is what you see in California, Arizona. I tend to equate the two, where you take politicians essentially out of it. I mean, you've got 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, and 4 independents. The 4 independents are going to be the ones who decide. The Republicans are going to go one way, Democrats are going to go the other way. But to have these nonpartisan, not bipartisan, but nonpartisan commissions, that I think is the best way to do it. The one that exists in Arizona is being now attacked by the Republicans. They're trying to infuse a little partisanship into that, and we have spent, I guess, $75,000 so far in trying to push back on that effort. We're supporting a ballot initiative that I guess will be before the voters in Ohio, I think next week or week after next, looking also at the possibility of these commissions in Michigan as well as in Colorado. Only state, you have to do these kind of state by state. Only state constitutions allow you to do it in this way. But we have to come up with a system where I think that is more neutral, because the reality now is that we have politicians picking their voters as opposed to citizens choosing who their representatives are going to be. And you've seen Democrats cut deals with Republicans so that incumbents are simply protected without any regard for what the wishes are of a particular constituency.
Yes. And that's an important norm, a bedrock principle of democracy, that citizens should pick the representatives.
It's supposed to be. That's the way it's supposed to work.
So even if we fixed all of the maps in the country, American democracy would still be far from perfect. Yeah. And one way it would be very imperfect is that a shockingly small number of Americans actually vote. So 56% of the voting age population turned out in the 2016 presidential election. So we're ahead of Slovenia, Chile, Japan, and Turkey, but behind everybody else in the OECD. We're 28 out of 35 roughly in OECD in terms of voting age participation turnout. So a couple questions there. Why do you think that is? Why aren't we're supposed to be the country that's the champion of democracy. Why are so few people participating in this basic democratic institution? And that's a first question. Second is, do you think it would be good? We're going to have a meeting, a discussion on Thursday about getting to 80%. It's kind of the moonshot of electoral participation. What would it take to get that voting age participation from 56 to 80%? Do you think it would be good if that many people participated? A bunch of them probably wouldn't know that much about politics. They might vote the wrong way. So two questions. Why, and would it be good?
I actually have a great deal of faith in the American people, and I'd like to have more citizens participating, more citizens voting. People have different degrees of knowledge when it comes to what we might consider, the most relevant of issues. Not everybody comes to this wonderful, institution. But I've got faith that the American people at a base level make appropriate decisions. And I think you're right, though. We have to increase the number of people who are participating. And I think the first thing is to look at, why are elections generally held on the first Tuesday in November? I mean,
it's because people had to get to market.
Exactly. You had to get to market. Some 19th century people are not. I haven't seen many, horse-drawn carriages here, and people bringing crops into Boston from the airport. Maybe that does happen. I don't know. And so we're kind of married to a system that might have been necessary back in the 1800s, but is not one that we need now. So if you're going to pick a day, it would seem you'd do it on a Saturday when people didn't have work obligations. But I think the better answer, you want to keep that Tuesday in November, let's just expand the amount of days, the number of days that people can actually cast a ballot. There's no indication, as too many Republicans have said, well, that'll voter fraud and all that kind of stuff. I'm going to get real partisan now. One of the things I think the Democrats stand for is that we want to have increased numbers of people voting. Republicans, given what they have done, especially over the last decade with these voter ID laws based on this notion of voter fraud, are trying to keep numbers of people away from the polls. So one party is for mass participation. The other party is saying, well, let's keep certain groups of people, out of the voting process. So I think, expanding the number of voting days, and then also about 25% of the voting age population is not registered to vote. Yes. And so coming up with ways in which we can make it easier for people to register. You get a license to drive, you're going to be automatically registered. North Carolina had a thing where they had juniors and seniors automatically, when they come of age, they automatically were registered. Republicans did away with that one. Really? I mean, what's that all about? Except that young people tend to be more progressive. And so if there are a number of ways in which we can just increase the number of people who are registered, then increase the days that people can cast a ballot, I think you could knock that number up pretty dramatically.
Good. And I'm sure there's many other things we could do as well. One of them that you don't hear much discussion about in the United States is compulsory voting, to actually give people a speeding ticket or something if they don't vote. More than 20 countries around the world have compulsory voting laws, places like Australia, Brazil, Belgium, for example. What do you think about that possibility? And it wouldn't even, $5.
$5?
$5 fine, yeah.
$5 fine. I think it probably worked better if you gave somebody $5 if they voted. In fact, that's been done before, but no, we don't want to go back. We don't want to go there. I'm not so sure I like the idea of compulsory voting, because in some ways, although I think everybody, especially given the sacrifices that people made, the lives that were lost to make sure that people had the right to vote, I don't think I'd want to make it compulsory, but I think voting obviously is very, very important. But people, I think, you can also make a statement by not voting, by saying the process is corrupt, the choices are terrible. I'm not gonna participate in the system. And so, I have grudging respect for somebody who truly believes that, as opposed to, I don't want to get up early, I don't want to wait in line. It's cold outside, it's rainy. So I don't think compulsion would be is a good element to put into the system.
Good.
Where'd you come up with that idea?
Well, 20 other countries
20
do
other
it.
countries.
I'm told that in Brazil, you have to vote, but there's about 4 or 5 different ways in which you can register not voting for the major. You're like, none of the above, or I don't like any of that. So
Alfred E. Newman.
Yeah, exactly.
You all wouldn't know who Alfred E. Newman is.
I think only a few people. Only a few people. Too young.
Mad Magazine.
It's really funny. Check it out.
Okay. All right.
All right. So let's move on to Russia investigation.
Mm-hmm. That wasn't the best segue I've ever heard. It was
I wanted to punctuate it.
Kind of mean right
people.
Turn there.
Provide the
all right.
chapter division for folks. So a few months ago, I began to ask a cocktail party question. Do you think that Bob Mueller will be able to complete his investigation by not being fired, by submitting a report? A few months ago, almost everyone I asked said, yes, of course. Otherwise, it would be a constitutional crisis. I've kept asking the question, and I haven't plotted it out. But in recent days, it feels more like a coin toss. People say like 50-50. What do you think the odds are that Robert Mueller will be able to complete the investigation and submit a report?
I'm not sure I come up with any numbers, but I feel that there's a disturbing inevitability. I almost feel it's hard to quantify that as Bob, and I've known Bob Mueller, I don't know, 25, 30 years, as he does the complete jobs I know he's going to do, it will almost inevitably draw him into the conduct of the president before he was president and what he was doing in Russia, if only for contextual reasons, but I think it'll probably be even more relevant than that. And I think if you take the president at his word, that is a red line. The recent Cohen, search warrants and all that happened there, I think maybe potentially lead you in that direction as well. And I think that increases, I think, in a very dramatic way, the possibility that he could be dismissed, and that we would then be in, a constitutional crisis.
So let's delve into that a little bit more, into what that would look like, and flip it around a little bit. Suppose you were still Attorney General and a special.
And Trump was president?
Think
about that one, folks.
You get to decide whether or not you want to take the job. So I don't know who's president.
I don't think I'd take as much as Jeff Sessions has.
Yeah.
There'd be a real constitutional crisis there.
Right there.
Just kidding. I wouldn't hit the president.
No. I wouldn't advise that.
Secret Service protection.
Yeah. So the scenario is the obvious one, is that special counsel has been appointed to investigate your president. your president orders you to fire the special counsel. Has happened at least once in U.S. history. We'll see if it happens again. Can you explain to the audience, most of whom I think are not lawyers, what would be some of the lines that that special counsel would have to cross before the point at which you would fire them rather than resign?
I mean, you'd have to have, I think, some kind of misconduct in office, some kind of indication of malfeasance by the special counsel, and in the absence of that, an order from the president to fire an acting appropriately special counsel is something that an attorney general simply has to say no. We were talking about this before. As Attorney General, you get to put 5 portraits of your predecessors up in your office and in the conference room. And one of the ones I had was Elliot Richardson, and he was there to remind me that being Attorney General, you have a great deal of responsibility, and your main obligation is to the system. Pat Leahy was chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and he said, you have to understand, as you're the Attorney General of the United States, you're not the Secretary of Justice, and there's a difference between the AG and any other cabinet member. And Richardson's portrait was there to remind me that if I ever got an order that I didn't think was appropriate, I had to remember that my obligation to the system was more important than my retention of the job.
And obligation to the president, then, by extension.
Yeah, and that was one of the good things about working with Harvard graduate Barack Obama. Pretty good school. He's a whole bunch of things, but he's also a very good lawyer who recognized that the best justice departments are the ones that are the most independent. And I actually think that he leaned too far over, and his administration his White House leaned too far in the other direction, where there were things we certainly could have spoken about that they were reluctant to ask about. When I made the decision to not defend the Defense of Marriage Act,
yes.
We were this is all going to be in my book, so I shouldn't be sharing this. It was a Super Bowl party at the White House, and I wanted to tell him, so he didn't read about it in the newspapers on Monday or whatever, about we're not defending DOMA. And so I told him that, and he said, man, I was trying to figure out how could I possibly let you know what I wanted you. He agreed with the decision, but was trying to figure out a way in which he might appropriately tell me that was his view. And so that gives you a sense of at least how that president viewed his Justice Department, as opposed to this president telling his Justice Department to go out and investigate, people.
That's a remarkable difference in stance toward the rule of law and judicial independence.
Yeah.
So, public trust in government. A lot of people right now, as you know, public trust in government is at nearly an all-time low. So when John F. Kennedy was president, about 75% of the population said they can trust the federal government to do what's right all the time or most of the time. Now it's more like 20-25%. It's quite low. Many people trace
20-25%.
Yeah, many people.
That's
I think it's a little higher. I think it's a little higher.
Well, that's
than
probably double what people think about Congress.
Yeah,
so
right. It is.
Haven't reached that level
yes.
yet.
Many people think that turn began at Watergate, the Vietnam War, but also Watergate as a cascading point at which the public institutions were falling apart. There was some deep corruption there. It seems possible that whatever the outcome of the Russia investigation is, it'll be another turning point. I mean, it's hard to imagine it going much lower than it is right now, but it could. And whatever the result of the investigation is, this may be another watershed moment in yet another ratchet down of public distrust in government and public institutions. If it is, what would you advise Bob Mueller, the Republicans, the Democrats, everybody, what would you advise them to do to minimize that long-term damage? I mean, everybody's thinking about the short term, whether they're pro-Trump or anti-Trump. What about the long game, trust in our institutions?
Well, let's assume that the investigation leads to, this is hypothetical, I'm not predicting this, but let's just assume that this led to the removal of the president, an impeachment proceeding, something along those lines. I think that would certainly have a short-term negative impact on trust in government, I suppose, constitutional crisis, whatever. But that would also show that our institutions held, that an independent investigation could be had, and that the most powerful person in the land was held accountable. So in some ways, I would see out of that negative thing, that negative crisis, there would be a positive side to it. But yeah, I mean, I understand how people get jaded or have this lack of confidence when you start with. I think it goes further back. I mean, from the Kennedy assassination and the lack of trust in the Warren Commission, obviously Watergate, Iran-Contra, later on, Vietnam War, and the things we found out about what the government did not tell us. But so I think that's the way I would try to have people look at that potential outcome. That the institutions held.
Yeah. On the other side of it, is Robert Mueller playing too much hardball? A lot of people criticize it wasn't him, it was the Southern District of New York that executed the search warrant on Michael Cohen's office and apartment. A lot of people would consider that a kind of hardball, constitutional hardball, really pushing the line that damages the institutions. Do you think it's too much hardball?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think you have to understand that decision to go into a lawyer's office is not one that an individual United States attorney can do under the DOJ regulations. That has to be approved in Washington, usually by the Assistant Attorney General of the Criminal Division. Now, I don't know this, but my suspicion is that the Deputy Attorney General probably signed off on that the raid, I guess, in the search warrants in those three places of Mr. Cohen. There's a great respect for the attorney-client privilege under DOJ regulations, and I think historically has proven to be the case, and it's an extraordinary thing to do that. So I don't think that this was inappropriate hardball. I mean, this is a serious investigation. You want to get to the bottom of it. Bob Muller did the right thing, I think, by referring it to the Southern District of New York, and the determination was made there that these search warrants in those three places, was appropriate. I think, and as I said, people in Washington had to sign off on it.
Very good. So several media outlets have reported that you're considering a presidential run in 2020. In the few responses that you've had to that question, you've echoed the theme of unifying America and moving beyond the divisive period that we're in as one reason why you might run. First question is, might you run? And then second question is, what would you do to unify? Things seem even more divided than than the last couple of presidents, for sure.
I mean, well, what I've said is that I'm thinking about this, and I'll decide, I think, sometime, next year. But at this point, I wouldn't say I'm more likely to do it than not. I'm thinking about it. So just thinking about it. But unifying the country, I think that this is a country that still has common interests, and we're still a nation of enduring values. And there's a basis, I believe, for us to recognize that. And I think that was the magic of the Obama candidacy in 2008. People, I think, tend to forget how magical it was in some ways. There was this notion of hope and change. And unity. Now, 2008 is almost like 1,000 years ago now. I mean, we're in a fundamentally different situation. But I'm still optimistic that if you have leaders who appeal to the people in appropriate ways and focus on that which binds us as opposed to that which divides us, that you can, even in these fractured times, bring about greater unity than we see now. I mean, this is a loud country, We're loud when it comes to politics. We're loud when it comes to sports. That's the beauty of this country. You know, we're loud about the things that we care most about. You know, politics among them. But that doesn't mean that because we're yelling at one another that we can't reach common ground, and that we can't, at the end of the day, be more unified than we are now.
So I believe that we are living in a historic moment, for better, for worse. If you did decide to run for president in 2020 and won the general...
He's not giving this up.
Just one more question on this. Then roll the tape forward to 2050. We have some historians in the audience. What would you want a historian to write about as your signal achievement? What's really important?
You mean assuming I won?
Yeah, you win the general.
Oh.
I'm already predicting that you win the general.
All right. Well, first, he was a 2-term president. How about this? Let's put it this way. What would I want historians to say in 2050 about Eric as Attorney General? How about that? That's you know, because I'm not committed to this.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd like to think that maybe people would say he didn't lose the common touch, that he stayed the person that he was, growing up in, you know, born in the Bronx, growing up in Queens, in New York City. That he wasn't afraid to ask difficult questions, make hard decisions, face hard truths, and that maybe left the country a little more fair, a little more just, infused with a little more equity. The nation was a little more equitable after he left. I mean, that would be an amalgam of that. Would be what I'd hope what people say about my time as AG.
Very good. I think they will say that. Last question before we open it up. So John McCain's book is coming out in later this month, or later in May. Some of the excerpts are out. In one part of the book, he asks, when did politics become the principal or only attribute that we use to judge people? Republicans and Democrats can be good neighbors, loving parents, loyal Americans, and decent human beings. So my last question before we open it up is, who's your favorite Republican?
That's an interesting question. Because I immediately come to those who I can't stand. But, you know, there are people who I think are... I think I just kind of think about the congressional folks I interacted with, who I think are, you know, I disagree with. You know, ideologically we're on different poles. Mike Lee from Utah, principled person. John McCain. I've had interesting phone conversations with Senator McCain. He's a very interesting guy. Jim Sensenbrenner from Michigan, congressman who, you know, we had some, you know, really some back and forths on some issues, but he's a person who has stood for remaking the Voting Rights Act after the disastrous Shelby County decision in the Supreme Court. So yeah, I mean, people. Those are just, you know, some of the folks. You know, Chuck Grassley, I think, you know, chairman of the Judiciary Committee, can actually. He at times, you know, I don't his staff. I'm not a fan of his staff, but I like Senator Grassley. So yeah, there are a few.
There's kind of people capable, principled, and not your principles, but capable of working together.
Yeah.
Very good.
Mm-hmm.
All right, thank you very much. So why don't we open it up now for people who have been to the forum, know the routine. There are 4 microphones. At 2 up there and 2 on the floor here, and the rules of the forum are 1 question per customer, introduce yourself, and every turn has to be an actual question, which means that what you say ends with a question mark. Shaniqua.
Good evening. So since this country, or at the founding...
You got to say who you are.
Oh, sorry, you just said my name. Shaniqua McClendon. I'm a second-year MPP student here at the Kennedy School. But so when this country was founded, it was pretty much founded on excluding people of color or non-white people from its democracy. And I think you could still argue that now with a lot of the gerrymandering that's going on. So in light of that, how do you encourage and make people of color feel like they should participate and are able to participate in this democracy? And if they can't, what are the implications of that?
Well, I think, the implications of people not being able to participate, being prevented from participating, that really gets at the core of our democracy. And you cannot call it a true democracy if there are attempts to exclude people from, the citizen decision making that is the right of every American. But what I would say to people of color, and especially to African Americans, is that, if anybody doesn't vote, you were talking about the relatively low number there, you disrespect people who gave their lives. Who, people say to me, "Oh, well, you had a tough time, Eric. It was such a tumultuous time as Attorney General." It's like, really? I mean, you think about what Dr. King, Ralph Abernathy, those 3 civil rights workers, in Philadelphia, Mississippi, who were there to register people to vote. Viola Liuzzo. These are heroes and heroines of mine. There's a direct line between my time as the first African American Attorney General, Barack Obama's tenure as first African American president, to their efforts. And you can't change anything if you don't participate in the process. And the way citizens participate in the process at the most basic of levels is to vote. But I also think that we have a responsibility as citizens to do more, that we need to be more civically engaged. I call this kind of a new American engagement. And I think you see the beginnings of it in reaction to the Trump presidency, and that might be the silver lining to what I think is really kind of an awful time for our country. I think that African Americans, other people of color, given how the imperfect way in which this nation was founded and is still in the process of trying to get to that more perfect union, have to be people who will cast a ballot, who will wait in lines. If you don't have adequate numbers of polling places in your district, you certainly got to protest that. But if it comes down to that, and you got to wait in line for 4 hours, you have to do that, because at the end of the day, you're more likely then to put people in place who will have, the next time around, adequate numbers of machines and polling places within a district.
Thank you.
Thank you. Up here, sir.
Good evening. My name is DeMarquin Johnson. I'm a joint degree student here at the Kennedy School and at Harvard Law School, and my question is about the relationship between the executive branch and the legislature. You're no stranger to a hostile Congress during your role as Attorney General.
Been watching TV, huh?
Yes, and I'm wondering, what is your philosophy or the principles you, during your position, went by when it comes to when Congress should give discretion to the executive branch or when the executive branch should answer to Congress? And in case your answer is that the judiciary should decide, how do you work around the innate partisanship within the judiciary branch?
Yeah, I actually think that the best way for the branches, executive branch, legislative branch, to kind of figure things out is to do what has traditionally been done. A lot of bluster, a lot of threats, and we're not going to do this. But at the end of the day, you sit down in a conference room and you kind of work your way through, appropriate accommodations. I think both branches have to realize that they're co-equal. That they have unique responsibilities. The legislative branch has oversight, obviously, over the executive. The executive has to, execute the laws. There's a way in which the branches can coexist. It has become so political, though, that I think the legitimate roles that each branch is supposed to play kind of gets obscured by the politics. I was held in contempt by the House of Representatives for not turning over some documents that reflected internal executive branch deliberations about how we were going to interact with Congress. That in the old days is something, I was Janet Reno's deputy attorney general, and they were going to hold her in contempt. And, we ultimately sat down in a room, figured it out, gave them a few documents, they were happy, and, we were totally unhappy. and it went away. This one, with me, there was a decision that they wanted to make an example of this guy. And when we found out that the NRA was going to score that vote, then it became clear what was going on. This wasn't about legitimate congressional oversight. This was about an exertion of power, of the gun lobby saying that this guy should be held in contempt. And so that's kind of where we are now. And so I think both sides have to kind of retreat from those positions if they can. I'm worried, though. I mean, if you look at this House the House Intelligence Committee report, that essentially exonerates the president, and it has such obvious and gaping holes. And Devin Nunes, the chairman, recused himself, but no, he's still in. And, it's almost farcical in a way. What they have done, and I think they've done great damage to a committee. I've testified in front of a whole bunch of committees. When you went to the Intel committees, just behind closed doors, there are no TV cameras, and there the partisanship tended to melt away, and that is not where we are now with regard to at least the House Intel Committee. I think Senate Intel Committee is probably in a different place, but it worries me a great deal that the House Intel Committee, when it was run by Mike Rogers, a Republican, Dutch Ruppelsberger, a Democrat from Maryland, they did it the way their predecessors always had. Just kind of what are the facts? What are the intelligence equities that we need to be concerned about?
Yes, up here.
Hi, my name is Hannah. I'm a freshman from the college. And I was actually wondering, so it's been in the news a lot lately, corporate mergers and how the Trump Justice Department is handling those. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how you would handle for example, the Time Warner AT&T merger if you were still Attorney General, and what your philosophy is towards that in general.
Yeah, the lens that we always looked through when we were considering mergers was what was the impact going to be on consumers, and tried to look not in a kind of purely academic, a real world way. What was the impact of a merger going to be on consumers? And so when there were airline mergers that were being considered, I think our instinctive reaction was these are probably not good things. But then when you looked at them in a real world sense and you saw how airlines were bleeding money, not being successful, and the need for strong, at least 3-4 strong airlines as opposed to 6, 7, 8 weak ones, whatever. We didn't think that the impact on consumers there was going to be so bad that we couldn't, taking into account the health of the industry, that we couldn't approve the mergers. Now, Time Warner, that's one again that I'd look and see. Well, how's this going to impact the choices of people, consumers? Am I still going to be able to get Netflix, at the appropriate speed, on my computer? Am I going to have to pay through the nose because I want to watch, Westworld, on HBO? I'm betraying a few things here. Billions is a great show on Showtime. Those are the kinds of real-world things. And you have these experts in the antitrust division who are non-lawyers, who can really kind of, work all of this stuff out and present. You look at the legal case, but then they have these experts who can really kind of tell you what the expected consumer impacts are going to be. And so that's, I think, and I still think that's the best way to look at these things. What's the impact going to be on consumers?
Very good. Yes.
Hi, my name's Ben Bolger, and I'm a Harvard alum. And I have a kind of a theoretical question for you about voting participation. There's a lot of instances where people reside legally in one area, but their actual life is another place. For example, people might live in New Jersey or Connecticut, but they spend most of their waking hour working and living effectively in New York City, or in this case, people might live in Rhode Island or New Hampshire, but effectively work in Boston or Cambridge. A lot of examples like that. Should we rethink how people participate as voters? Should it be based on their legal residence, or should we be more creative in how we view stakeholders and voters in cities and other locations?
It's interesting. I guess I'm kind of a traditionalist, and I like the idea of people voting where they live. And I guess my thought would be that that's probably the place that you care the most about, you know. If I lived in New Hampshire, you know, worked in Boston, you know, I want to make sure that Boston's a great city, you know, that's fine. I want it to be, you know, safe, and I want to be able to, you know, have, you know, good transportation system. But I'm going to care most about, you know, the schools in New Hampshire where my kids are going to get educated. I'm going to care most about, you know, what's going to happen to the main asset I probably have, which is my house. So I think I'd be a little wary of changing the way in which we do that. But that's actually pretty interesting. That's actually kind of interesting, though. So I hadn't really thought about that before.
Very good. Yes, over here.
My name is Kyle Burton, and I'm a dual degree candidate with the medical school and the Kennedy School. And you've mentioned that gerrymandering is one of the issues facing democracy right now.
Wait, you're doing medical school and Kennedy School?
That's correct, yeah.
Wow. Whoa. Okay.
So
Yeah.
Pretty impressive.
and so is he, so. Yeah. But you mentioned gerrymandering is one of the issues facing democracy, and I'm wondering, 538 released an article stating self-sorting and extremism as some of the issues instead of gerrymandering that could lead to there being disproportionate representation. So what initiatives are the NDRC undertaking in order to combat self-sorting, extremism, and any other issues?
Well, you know, self-sorting extremism, I mean, you know, I'm not totally sure I understand. Does it mean the residential, where people live?
Right, so that impacting, I guess, what people vote for.
Yeah. You know, there's an article written by Ari Berman that I would urge everybody to look at. It's called The 5 Myths of Gerrymandering. And one of them is this notion that gerrymandering is simply this packing of districts, or the way in which the place where people live is really a prime determinant in, you know, how lines are drawn, or, you know, all Democrats are all urban, and therefore, you know, that's not really the case. I mean, yeah, where people live obviously has an impact on how lines should be drawn, but gerrymandering, you know, goes way beyond the kind of self-sorting that people do, and you know, kind of puts the self-sorting on steroids to come up with effects that are, I would say, inappropriate, and hopefully after the Supreme Court rules, hopefully in June, hopefully will be deemed illegal. But I would really urge you to read that article, because one of the things that he talks about is this notion that because Democrats are, you know, largely seen as urban creatures, that's a huge component of you know, of why we have the representational system that we do. It really is not as big a factor as people think.
Yes, up here.
Hi, my name's Jin. I'm a senior at the college, and I'm also from Queens, which I didn't know about you.
But East Elmhurst.
I'm from Flushing.
There you go. That's close by. Q48 from my house to.
That's right. I don't actually know if that line exists anymore, but.
Whoa! Just throwing shade here, man. Wait.
76 all the way. No,
tough audience here.
Hey, Queens, you know what?
Just kidding. Okay, so I actually have a.
I know people in the administration. What year are you?
I'm a senior.
You what?
Senior at the college.
Senior. You're going to enjoy that extra year.
Yeah. No. Okay, so I actually have I think a complicated question. So I'm actually a DACA recipient. So I'm an undocumented immigrant. And so I think, obviously, the title of the talk today is Making Every Voice Count. And obviously, I think, from my perspective, that one of the assumptions is that everyone is at the table from a perspective of equality in terms of the justice and how justice is administered. The way that my community, that I and the undocumented community has experienced immigration enforcement it seems to be very political, in that because the immigration courts are ultimately under the direction of the Attorney General, which is obviously a political appointment. I mean, it shouldn't be, but obviously a lot of these norms are being broken. that the way that we experience enforcement is actually just a political tool. So I'm wondering, my question is, what are some legislative tools, or what are some legislative guardrails that we can advocate for that kind of put guardrails against immigration enforcement being used as a political tool? Because, I mean, I think the actual question is whether or not we're going to treat a subset of Americans, in this case being immigrants, as a separate category because they're immigrants. And a lot of Republicans talk about this as a national security issue. But I'm wondering, like, how you think we can kind of engage the legislative kind of side of the federal government to make sure that this doesn't really happen as a political tool.
I mean, I think, we've spent a lot. What was that? Oh, okay, right, yeah.
It's probably after the Q48 line.
Q48, yeah. Desus and Mero, I was on that show. I like that, right. We have focused a lot of time, and I think appropriately so, on a resolution of the DACA issue. I think that what we tried to do there was appropriate, and the opposition by Republican state attorneys general and now by this administration is really just, that is, I think, in some ways politics at its worst. It's an attempt to stoke a base, and it's fundamentally unfair. And, you talk about gerrymandering. The majority of the American people are on behalf of, stand with DACA recipients, and yet, because of gerrymandering, Republicans who, even though they might have, people in their district, majority of people in their district who support DACA recipients, they don't have to work. They don't have to listen to them because they're in safe districts, and that's how, you have the ability. You have how the will of the people does not therefore get expressed. So I think we should focus on DACA, but I think we can't lose sight of where we almost were, which is to come up with a comprehensive immigration bill. And I think your focus on legislation makes a great deal of sense. It was the Gang of 8 or whatever it was. We need to solve this issue because it's larger than simply the DACA recipients. There's a huge undocumented population here in the United States that really is part of the fabric of this country. I mean, these are folks who are just parts of our communities. They're our neighbors, We work with them. They do a variety of, they contribute to this country in the way that immigrants always have. And this is something that really gets me. This notion that immigration is bad or that other countries send their worst to us, as the president said in his, when he announced his candidacy. The reality is that the best people from other countries are the ones who come here. I mean, who would uproot themselves, go across oceans, whatever, or come through, substantial amounts of land to take jobs that are probably, relatively low on the socioeconomic scale, deal with, ethnic, racial, economic discrimination. Those are the people. This is my father. This is my grandparents. These are the people who revitalize this nation, keep bringing new ideas, new thoughts, new ways of doing things into the nation. More homogenous, staid nations are at, I think, a competitive disadvantage compared to the United States because of our the immigrant flow and our immigrant heritage. And something I think people need to understand here, unless you are descended from the indigenous people, Native Americans, you are of immigrant stock. If your folks came over on the Mayflower, guess what? Those were immigrants. Now, the question is, just how far back do you go? I say my father, my grandparents. But everybody in this room, unless, as I said, you're one of the indigenous people, you are of immigrant stock. And the notion that we would turn our back on that heritage, which has made this nation great, which has kept this nation great, I think we do so at our peril, and we give up a competitive advantage that we have against other nations in the 21st century.
Very good.
We have time for just one more question up here.
Okay. Hello, thank you for coming. I'm Akinwande Lalude. I'm in the MPID program here at the Kennedy School. This is the Development Economics program.
Okay.
And
you're not going to be a doctor also?
No, close, but no. And I'm not going to ask you if you're going to run for president either. So it's going to be a little bit of a different question. So you were working with Uber on doing an investigation into the Me Too issue, and I was just wondering, kind of in a theoretical sense, if you were talking to an organization and they had hired somebody who was like the target of sexual harassment, and that person wasn't hired because of the quality of their work, but specifically to be a target by their manager of sexual harassment. I was wondering, from the perspective of both an investigator and an attorney general, how would you handle the fairness in that situation if the company wanted to fire that person because they weren't hired to do the job, they were just hired as some other manager's, like, target?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot would depend on how the person who was hired was treated during that person's time in the company. If the person was wholly unqualified, I don't think that person should necessarily have to stay in the company. I mean, I'm not talking about wholly unqualified now, stay in the company. On the other hand, if that person was a member of the company for some period of time and suffered harassment from that manager, well, I would think that person is entitled to some kind of compensation. And I would also think that, you say wholly unqualified, I'd want to think that, if that person in good faith thought that he or she could contribute to the company, that maybe you want to offer training to them so that they have an ability to perhaps contribute to that company. Now, you'd want to toss that manager out as quickly, as you can, and as openly as you can, so that people understand that that's not the way in which this company operates. But you wouldn't want to also re-victimize somebody who's brought in and then has to deal with this knothead manager, and then lose their job as well. So come up with creative ways, compensation kind of, I think, as a baseline, but then maybe come up with creative ways in which you might make that person qualified to contribute to the company.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
So we'll do one more question because we've got another doctor.
My name is Ellen.
Kennedy School, medical school.
Yes, sir. I apologize.
What else?
Rocket scientist.
Rocket scientist. There we go. Yeah. Astrophysics.
My name is Ellen. As Dean Fung said, I am a student at the medical school in the Kennedy School. And thank you for making space for this one last question. And so you understand that structural racism is at the core of many of the public policy problems and problems of democracy that we face as a nation. In fact, you've been on record as saying that we are, quote, a nation of cowards when it comes to discussing and confronting the role of racism in our institutions.
I want to interrupt here.
Mm-hmm.
But I did say that. February 2009, Black History Month speech, I said we're a nation of cowards when it comes to discussing things racial. But that speech is like, it was almost like I got up and said, we're a nation of cowards, thank you very much. Mm-hmm. I actually read the speech about 2-3 weeks ago. It's still online, I think, at the Justice Department. The speech is actually held up pretty well, I think. And so I would urge you all to read. There's more than that one line. But I'm sorry, so go ahead. So read the speech. Read the speech.
I think you're right in saying, it is kind of a tradition of American institutions to be reluctant or explicitly aversive to engage the issues, from the White House to the Attorney General's office, even to this institution, to really confront the role of racism, not just in society broadly, but specifically in terms of the public policy problems that it's trying to solve. For instance, we managed to have a conversation about voter participation without talking about mass incarceration and the racial undertones there. Or, we talked about the Voting Rights Act without talking about the racial undertones there. So I'm wondering, in speaking to a room of current and future public leaders, what your advice would be regarding how to be less cowardly in confronting the foundational role of racism in the problems that we face as a nation.
Yeah, I think it's a real good question. we are, and as I said this in the speech, we are really adept at avoiding racial conversation. And in some ways it's understandable given, how the nation was founded, the original sin of slavery, Jim Crow after that. Another book I would recommend to you, Slavery by Another Name by Doug Blackman, that talks about, what it was like in the South in the late 1800s, early 1900s, actually, almost through the mid 1900s. We're good at avoiding, racial conversations. We're too good at avoiding racial conversations. Race is something that is still a factor in this nation. It's being used, I think, as a wedge issue. There, with dog whistles, a whole variety of ways in which it's used. And unless we ultimately confront our racial past, deal with the continuing problems of racial injustice and inequality in our present, we're never going to have a future that I think this nation can have. But that will mean some difficult conversations. And that will mean, institutions are going to have to adjust to, and I think, make amends for things that happened in the past. But it's more than institutions. It really comes down to an individual level as well, But I think people on both sides of the divide have to give the other side space. If you're a person of color, you have got to be open-minded enough to allow white folks to raise issues, raise concerns, to be sincere in raising things that you might say, well, that's ridiculous. No, that's not the way to react. We need a dialogue. We don't need, arguments about this. I mean, these can be heated dialogues. I get that, but we don't get to where we need to be unless we engage in a very serious way. And we have not, as a nation, done that. We do it in fits and starts, but it's something that I think this nation still has not come to grips with.
And I think in every part of this nation, it's difficult to have those conversations, and it's not easy here at the Kennedy School, not easy at Harvard University. We're trying to do better at that. One of the norms that we're trying to inculcate a little bit is the norm of both speaking bravely but also listening generously. And so
that's said much more eloquently than I did, but that's exactly the point I was trying to make, that listening, in the way that you described, has to be a part of that process. It has to be. That's the last question.
And so thank you very much.
All right.
Glenn, you want to do something?
I just want to say something. All kidding aside, you all are the best and the brightest. You really are. The kind of country that we're going to have, and we've kind of talked about, will be a function of what it is that you all decide to do with your lives and the role that you decide to play in this country, in the shaping of this country in the 21st century. I think that we appropriately called the last century an American century. I think this century, this young century, can be an American century as well. But it'll only happen if people like yourselves find ways in which you become civically involved. You can be great doctors. You can be great businessmen. And we as Americans, I want you all to do well, but I also want you to do good. And I think you have that within yourselves. And the reality is that if you are not civically engaged, if you're not leading people who are less bright, less idealistic, less committed to the principles that of America at its best, will fill that vacuum. And that America will not be the America that it is capable of being. Dr. King said that the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice. but it really only bends towards justice when people like you put their hands on that arc and pull it towards justice. So my hope would be that you will use the superb education that you have received at this great institution and leave with a sense of purpose, a sense of obligation, a sense of responsibility. God gave you great brains. You had great opportunities here. But with that, I think, comes a profound responsibility to make better. Not only to make better this country, and if you do that, I think you'll make better this world. But I think you have that capacity. And I don't think you should ever forget that. I think you have that capacity. And so I hope that this is in some small way will maybe lead you to think about those kinds of things. And then be the leaders that you're capable of being. And make this country, we say we're going to make America great again. Well, you all can make America great. You really can. You have that ability, you have that responsibility. So do it.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jay. As always.